Hey, what's going on guys, it's Hanson. So today we're back with a brand new video and we're going to go over all of the basics of React.js in this video. So by the end of this whole video, you guys should have a better understanding of what React is, how React works, and how to actually build out a simple application with React. Okay, so first of all, what exactly is React? Well, React is a JavaScript library that allows you to build out user interfaces. You can build single page applications, you can build progressive web applications, you can even build mobile applications with React Native, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, the nice thing about React is that it takes care of a lot of things underneath the hood for us, so that as a developer, we don't need to worry about all of the things that we're going to be doing over and over again, because React handles it for us underneath the hood. So for example, if we want to load a bunch of elements that we fetched from a database, well, in regular HTML and CSS, we would have to loop through every single one and manually create a bunch of different node elements and then insert them into the DOM. With React, it does that for us underneath the hood, and it supports dynamic rendering. So there's a whole lot to go over in React, but we're going to try to go over just the basics in this video. So anyways, let's actually go ahead and get started. So the very first thing that you want to make sure you have installed is Node.js. I'm assuming that most of you guys already have it already, but just in case you don't, go over to nodejs.org and download the latest version. You can download the LTS or the current. I'm using version 14, and I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code, so you can download that from code.visualstudio.com. And for React.js, we don't need to download anything, but you just need to make sure you have Node.js installed, because we will be using Create React App. So right over here in my Windows PowerShell, I'm going to go into the Documents folder, and I'm going to go ahead and type npx create react app, and this is going to be a command that's going to generate a React project for us. Okay, it's going to build out a scaffold for us that we can use. You don't need to install anything. Like I said, you should have the npx command out of the box when you install Node.js. Now I'm going to give my project a name. So I'm going to go ahead and just say my React app. Okay, and now this should take a couple of seconds. So we're just going to let it create the application for us. You can see that our React app has finished generating. So we can actually go inside this my React app folder. So I'm going to cd into that folder. And I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code by typing code dot. So it's going to open up this folder inside Visual Studio Code for us, as you can see. Now you're going to see there's a bunch of different files that's generated. We're going to go through each one of these one by one. So the node modules folder, this is where all of your dependencies for your project is going to be installed. So quite often, whenever you need to build out your applications, you might need to install a third-party library code that someone else wrote and they put it on the registry, for example, npm or yarn, and you want to install it so you can use it. So you would install something like npm I Axios. So that's a library to make HTTP requests, and that would pretty much install all the code inside this node modules folder. Now you're never going to need to touch this folder at all, so don't worry about it. We then have the public folder. So this is where we have the index.html file. This is an important file because if you look right over here, we have this div with the ID of root. This is where our React app is actually going to be mounted on. So I'll get a little bit more into that when we get into the source folder, which is right now. So we have the source folder, and you can see if we open it, we have a bunch of different files inside the source folder. So the only file that you need to really pay attention to is the index.js file. But I'm going to explain everything else, so don't worry. So starting from index.js, this is our entry point. This is the main file. So do not touch this file at all. Like, do not delete it. Do not mess around too much with it. This is just the entry point to our application. You can see on line 1, we are importing React. On line 2, we are importing React DOM. Okay, in case you guys don't know, React runs on the virtual DOM. So it's going to use React DOM, and it's going to basically render the app onto the DOM itself. Okay, and you can see right over here on line 11, we reference document.getElementID, and you can see it's looking for roots, which is right over here, this index.html, it looks for right over here, and then it mounts whatever is inside here, which is the app component. And you can see on line 4, we are importing app. So if we go inside app.js, this is all of the code for our component. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the syntax and all of this stuff of a component later on. But you can see we are importing it and then we are mounting it just like this. Now it's very tempting for you to think that this is HTML, but it's actually not HTML. Okay, it's actually known as JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML. On line 5, we import service worker, and then we have it like right over here. But you don't have to worry about the service worker, because that's out of the scope of this whole video. I'm not going to delete anything because I don't want you guys to be super confused. We're just going to leave everything the way as it is. But then we also have a couple other files too, such as the index.css. So if you want to style up your components, you can do so inside the index.css, or you can create your own CSS file and then import it. And we also have app.css, so this CSS file is for the app.js file. And then we also have other things too, such as app.test.js, so this is for unit testing. We're not going to do any of that in this video, so you can ignore this. We also have the logo.svg. We also have the service worker.js file, and then setup tests.js. Now outside of source, we have the gitignore, so this is for ignoring certain files so that they're not staged to Git. We have the package.json file, the readme, and we have a yarn.lock file. Okay, so now that we've gone through the whole structure of this whole project, let's actually run this application so we can see what it looks like. So npm run start, or we can actually just do npm start. So now this is going to open up your application on port 3000 localhost, and you can see this. There you go, we have our simple React application. And the nice thing about our app is that well, this is actually part of React scripts, is that every single time we make a change, and if we save, so let's delete this, now you can see that it actually auto reloads, so we don't have to manually restart our application over and over again. Okay, now before we even get started with writing our code, let's actually go through the anatomy of our component real quick. So every single React component, we're going to need to import React. Okay, so you can see that's happening on line 1 over here. Now on line 2, it's importing a static file. So you can see it's importing logo from logo.svg, which is this file over here. And if you actually open up the React app, that's this file over here. This is static. And then it's importing the app.css. So if we were to actually delete these two, well, we would get an error because it's saying the logo is not defined. That's because it's being used right over here. So let's delete it. And you can see that all of our CSS is gone. Now let's go over here inside line number 3 where we have this function app. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit. So we pretty much have a regular function over here. Okay, and inside this function we have this return keyword. Now this is pretty much going to return all of the JSX that is going to be rendered to the DOM. Now, you're probably wondering, why didn't I call this HTML? Well, that's because it's very tempted to think that this is HTML because it looks very similar, but it's actually not HTML. It's actually JSX, okay, which stands for JavaScript XML. And it's pretty much, you can think of it like very similar to HTML. You have a div, you have a header, you have all of your HTML tags, but then you also have your attributes as well. Okay, and they're called JSX attributes. So you can see right over here, we have class name equals app. And what exactly does class name mean? Well, in HTML, we have the HTML attribute called class, which allows us to reference certain classes that are going to apply all the styles from the CSS file to said element. But in JSX, it's actually class name. So pretty much if you were to do class, it'll actually give you an error. So instead, it's supposed to be class name and not class. Okay, so it's pretty much, there are some differences, and you can actually just look up all of the different attributes that differ between JSX and HTML. Okay, but aside from that, everything else is pretty much very similar to HTML, if not the same. So it shouldn't be too complicated to figure it out. Okay, and you can see right over here that we have our header, we have our paragraph tags, our links. Okay, very simple stuff, just like a regular HTML file. And then we are returning all of this, so all of this code is going to be mounted pretty much onto the DOM. If you look over here, index.html, it's going to be mounted inside this root. Okay, this div with the ID of root. And to show you guys this, we can actually go inside our dev tools. If I open up my browser and if I open up the inspector, and if I click on elements, now if you look right over here, if you look at the div ID root, you can see we have some code over here. Okay, and you can see we have all of the HTML right over here, and this is all coming from this file over here. If I were to delete all this, you can see that if we expand it, you can see we have div class. So remember, in JSX, the class is class name. Okay, over here, we have the class of app, and it's an empty div. There's nothing in here. And then on line 11, we are exporting the app. So this is something pretty straightforward. You're exporting it so that you can import it in index.js or import it wherever you want. And then you can reuse it over and over again. Okay, so let's actually do this. Let's delete these two files. Let's delete app.js and app.css. Okay, because I want to start from scratch. Now we're going to get an error, obviously, because it's saying no such file, and that's fine. So on index.js, we are importing app. Now you can actually name this whatever you want. You can name it something like main or main app or home, whatever it is that you want. We're just going to leave it alone and call it app. Okay, and I'm also going to delete the test file as well, because we're not going to be doing any testing or unit testing. So let's delete that. So let's go ahead and create a new file. Let's call it app.js. Remember, this is going to be the main component of our application, and every single component needs to import the React library. So we're going to import React from React. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to use the function keyword to create a function, and we'll call it app. But again, you can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to go ahead and export default app. So that way we can import it inside index.js. Now you're going to see that we're getting an error over here because nothing was returned from render. So that's normal because we aren't returning anything to be rendered to the DOM. So let's return something. So we're going to use the return keyword, and we're going to go ahead and specify a pair of parentheses. So this is going to allow us to group together pretty much a JSX element, so we can wrap everything inside a div, and I can render an h1 tag. So I can say hello world. Now if I save, you should see it says hello world. And if we go inside the inspector, you can see that inside this div we have an h1 of hello comma world. Now what if we tried to create a div outside of this div, right? What if I did like an h2 my name is Anson? Now you're actually going to notice that we're going to get an error, and it's saying right over here that parsing error, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. The reason why this is happening is because you can only have one parent element returned. So if we wanted to return two divs, we'd actually need to wrap them inside one div and return it like this. Okay, because remember, you can only return one root element. Okay, and you can see that we have two divs. Okay, my name is Anson, hello world. So this is pretty much a very simple example of what you can do with React. Okay, so you can pretty much do everything that you can do in HTML. So for example, if you wanted to display an unordered list, you can do that. So let's just say this is some kind of shopping list, and we can say food, water, kitchen utensils, and etc. And we can see that we have our HTML over here. Okay, so pretty much, like I said earlier, a React project, a React app can be composed of many different components. So for example, let's say if we were to look at a simple website, let's look at React.js.org, for example. So you can think of every single element as its own component. So this nav bar over here is its own component. Okay, this little, I don't know what you call this, but I guess a Jumbotron, or in Bootstrap you call this Jumbotron, or like this main header over here, you can think of this as its own component. You can think of all of this stuff over here as its own component. You see this live JSX editor. You can think of this as its own component as well. Okay, and pretty much everything over here, you can just try to think of everything as its own component. We have a footer down here. Okay, this could be its own component. Okay, and why is it the reason that we need to pretty much write our own custom components? Why can't we just put everything in one file? Well, the whole point is to reuse certain components over and over and over again. If you just put everything in one file, it makes it very hard to, one, maintain the code, and it makes it very hard to debug as well, and doesn't make your code modular, right? What if you wanted to reuse, for example, what if you wanted to reuse this live JSX editor component over and over again? If you have it in one file, well, you're probably going to be prone to rewriting it, like copying and pasting the same code into every single other component or every single other page. And it just becomes very, very annoying and very tedious to maintain everything. So the whole principle is write it once and then use it as many times as you want. So let's go ahead and write out our very first component, okay? So we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it components. And this is what I like to do. I like to create a folder called components. And inside this folder, I'll create a bunch of different components. So for example, if I want to create a component called navbar, I'll just call it navigation.js. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import React, because remember, every single component you need to import React. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to create a function. So function navigation. Okay, and I'm also going to export it as well. So export default navigation. And our function needs to return something. It needs to return a JSX. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and return a simple div. And inside this div, we're going to have our links. So we're going to go ahead and have an unordered list. And I'll just simply say list and then an A. And we'll just say Google. And I'll just copy and paste a bunch of different list items over here. So now that we have our simple navigation bar, we can go ahead and import it to app.js, or again, wherever we want. Because remember, we can use this component over and over again. So let's import navigation from components, navigation. Okay, and if I want to render this, the way that we do that is we can actually do it the same way that you would render your normal HTML elements. So for example, if you wanted to render a div, you would do something like less than bracket div and then greater than bracket. Okay, well, you would do the same thing with your custom components. So less than bracket, navigation, and then greater than bracket. So if we go over here, you can see we have our navigation bar. Okay, very, very simple stuff. Now for shorthand, you can actually close off this tag over here with a /. So instead of having to do this, you can just simply get rid of that and then close it off like that. That's a shorthand symbol. And if you look right over here, we have our navigation bar. Okay, so it doesn't really do anything right now, but don't worry. The point is to show you guys how to import your custom components and then reuse them. Okay, so let's go ahead and create another component. Now, actually, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call it pages. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a home page. I'll import React because even though we're calling it a page, it's still a component. Okay, this is just a convention. You don't have to call it page. You can call it a component if you want. It doesn't really matter. But just to separate the difference between pages and components, typically pages would be its own individual component that is for the entire route. Okay, and the page itself can have a bunch of different child components. So let's go ahead and create a function. And let's also export it as well. And what I'll do is I'll return a simple div that says home page. Okay, so now if I wanted to show the home page, well, I could actually just return this right over here. So for example, if I wanted to import it, so let's import home page from pages, home page, and let's go over here, home page. If I save, you can see we have our home page. So right now the problem here is that we have a page, but we actually don't have a specific route for that page to be rendered on. So what exactly is a route? Well, let's say, for example, if I wanted to visit, let's say, tutorial, you can see up top over here, it says reactjs.org/tutorial.html. That itself right over there is a route. If I go to blog, it's going to go to its own route over here. If I go to community, it's going to go to the /community/support.html route. So these are routes, okay? Each route can have its own React component that is rendered to the page. The problem here is that we actually don't have our own routes set up. Now, to do that, we're actually going to need to use a third-party library called React Router. Now, we're going to do that in a separate video because that's out of the scope of the tutorial. So don't worry so much about that though. We'll cover that in the other video. But for now, let's just leave this alone as the home page. Okay, and you can see right over here that because we are using both of these components inside app, they're both actually rendered on the same page. We have the navigation bar and we have the homepage component. And if we were to open up the DevTools, you can see that we have our div with an unordered list, and we have our div with an homepage h1. Okay, so now that you guys have a basic understanding of how to create your own components, let's actually talk about props. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new component, and we can call it whatever we want. I'll just call this user profile.js. Okay, now this component is going to be used to render a user profile so that they can see their username, their age, their email. So let's import React from React. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a function, call it user profile, and we're going to return a div. Now inside user profile, we want to show the user's username, their age, as well as their email address. So I can go ahead and do something like h2 Anson. So name Anson. I can go ahead and also do something like h3 age 22, and then we can do something like p tag email Anson@anson.com. Just a simple example. Now I'm going to go ahead and export this user profile component, and I'll import it inside homepage. So let's import user profile from. Now we have to actually go out one directory because we're inside pages, and we need to step inside components and reference user profile. And I'll go ahead and I will render that. And now let's see what it looks like. So we have our simple user profile card. Okay, very simple stuff. Now here's the problem. We have all of these values hard-coded, but what if we wanted to actually render this based on what we got from some kind of server? Let's say if you're building some kind of, social media application and the endpoint returns the user's data. How would we actually render that dynamically? Well, typically what you would do is you would pass in those values as a prop into said component. Now, obviously I could have done something like this. I could have just pasted that in there and it would have worked just fine. But remember, the whole point of components is to create it once and reuse it over and over again. So if, let's say, somewhere else aside from homepage, we want to use the user profile component. We want to render the user's profile. Well, we can create a component and then we can use it inside homepage, and we can also use it somewhere else. Okay? But this time, we don't want to hard code any values. We want to pass in values that could potentially be sent from a server or wherever, some kind of file server, wherever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just create some mock data. So inside homepage, we will go ahead and create a mock user. And the user is going to have a name. So just give it the name of Anson. The age will be 22. And then email anson@anson.com. Now let's go and render user profile. Now, how do we actually get these values inside the user profile component? Well, this is where we can pass down props into child components. Okay, so what I can do is I can say, hey, look, the user profile component, this is going to have a prop called user. It's going to have the value of whatever user is. So now inside user profile, we need to take in that prop. So what we can do is we can actually pass in this props parameter. And before we do anything else, let's actually console log this. And let's see what it looks like. You can see we have this object over here, userprofile.js, and you can see it's just a user prop. So if I wanted to actually reference age, email, and name, I would have to do props.user.name. Same thing with the age and the email property. So instead of having these hard-coded values, well, I can simply do something like props.user.name. Now you're going to notice that it actually doesn't give us the actual value. It just gives us what we typed in. The reason why is because we're trying to reference the value of props.user.name. And when you want to reference the value of a variable and have it rendered to the DOM, you actually need to interpolate it by simply using a pair of curly braces. So in between here, we're going to wrap this in between curly braces. Okay, and this will pretty much interpolate. It will take the value of props.user.name and it'll actually render that to the screen. And there you go. We have our name. We'll do the same thing with our age. So props.user.age. And we'll do the same thing with email. And you'll see that it's rendered right over there. And if I were to at some point change, let's say, the value of age and the name or email to whatever we want, you can see that it'll also update over here. So that's much better than hard coding our values inside user profile, because now I can reuse this component and I can also pass in props as well, but those props can be different values. So for example, let's go ahead and create another user. Let's give it a name. Let's call it Andy, age 20, email andy@gmail.com. And let's go ahead and render another user profile, but this time I'll pass in user2 as a property. And there we go. We have our user profile right over here. So we can reuse this component as many times as we want. There's no limit. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about are lists and rendering them. So right now we have 2 user profiles. Okay, now we can actually create a third user. So let's do that. And let's just give this its own properties. So we'll just say j, age 20, email j@gmail.com. Okay, and we'll render them the same way that we've been doing. And now if I go over here, you can see we have our user profile card or user profile component being rendered here. Now if I look on the DOM, you can see we have our user profile being rendered here. Now what if we had, let's say, 10 different users that need to be rendered to DOM? You wouldn't want to create manually 10 different users and then copy and paste this 10 times. Instead, what we can do is we can actually dynamically render every single one of those users to the DOM. Okay? Now typically if you were fetching data from some API, it should return those users in an array or a list. Okay? So let's actually do that real quick. Let's go ahead and create an array of users. So I'll simply just copy and paste all this. Copy and paste this right over here. Okay, and we'll copy and paste the third user. Very simple. So we have an array. Okay, now obviously our code is going to break because these are not defined. So let's just get rid of this temporarily. Okay, so now how do we actually render all three of these users to the DOM? We have 3 users. We want to render every single one of them. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to reference this users array. And we're basically going to map every single element that's inside this array, and we're going to transform it into a JSX element. Okay, so essentially we have this array. And if we want to use JavaScript expressions, we can wrap them in between curly braces. So I can do something like users, and I can reference map. Okay, and what I want to do is for every single user inside this array, I want to return a JSX element. How do we do that? Well, with this arrow function, we can return user profile, and I can simply just pass in the user prop, just like that. I know this might seem very confusing, but we're going to go through it one more time. You can see that it's all being rendered, but let's actually show a couple of more examples, because we don't really quite understand what's going on here, and I don't want you guys to, walk away from the video not understanding what's going on here. So what's happening here is we have this users array, okay, and we are calling a dot map. If you don't know what dot map does, it basically will return a new array with the transformation applied by the callback function, which in our case, the callback function is this right over here. Now this callback function is going to return a user profile JSX element. Okay, it's basically going to go inside this user profile component. It's going to apply all the props to it, and it's going to return it. So if we actually look in the HTML, you can see that we have everything rendered to DOM. Okay, so if we wanted to, we can actually do this with other things too. So let's go ahead and create an array. Let's call it numbers. Let's populate this with a bunch of different numbers. And let's say if I want to render all of these numbers as a list to the DOM. So what I can do is I can reference numbers. I can call dot map. And for every single number, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and wrap that number in between the list item element. And if we look at the screen, you can see we have all of our numbers being rendered. Okay, so I highly encourage you guys to try to practice this on your own, because I know this can be very confusing to a lot of people. So I want you guys to practice it on your own so you can get a better feel of it. Okay, but we can pretty much do whatever we want inside this transformation, right? I don't need to put it inside a list item. I can put it inside, let's say, a div. And I can also just put it inside a h4 tag, and then I can wrap it in between a list item. And you can see right over here, it changes a little bit. We can even apply CSS styling to it too. So if I want, I can use the style attribute, and I can go ahead and give it a color of, let's say, red. There you go. And we can change the font size as well. You can do whatever you want. The whole point of this is that it's basically transforming the list of objects, a list of JSON objects, or whatever element it is, and it's basically transforming it into a bunch of JSX elements so that it can actually be rendered to the screen. Because you can't just render a JSON object, you need to actually transform it to a JSX element. Okay, so hopefully that whole thing makes sense. And the reason why you'd want to do this is because, like I said, you don't know how many elements you'll be having, so it makes sense to render them dynamically. So making sure that they're in a list first or an array, and then transforming each one. So users.map, every single element is going to be a user object, and then we'll pretty much just pass in the user profile prop, just like this. And notice how I don't have this wrapped inside parentheses because it's only one line, so I don't need to. If we wanted multiple different elements inside here, then we can wrap it inside the parentheses. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, one more thing that I want to address before we move on. If you actually look in the console, it says each child in a list should have a unique key property. So this is a warning. Your app will still work, but you definitely want to make sure that you specify a key for all of the elements that you're rendering dynamically. Okay, so for example, if we actually specify another parameter, this is going to be the index of which element this corresponds to. So we can give this a key of whatever the index is. Typically what you'd want to do though is your user should have some kind of unique identifier. So it could be, their unique ID, their email, username, whatever. And you'd want to use that as the key. But doing this will actually just get rid of the warning. But since we're mapping it though, this index property will just basically be the position of where the object or element is located. So for the first one, it'll be 0, 1, and then 2 for the second and third. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about conditional rendering. So what exactly is conditional rendering? Well, basically, conditional rendering allows us to render certain components or JSX elements based on some kind of condition. It's kind of like in regular programming, you have the if-else condition or switch statements. And if, let's say, for example, if the number 5 is greater than 2, then you want to print out some kind of message. Well, in our case, let's say if we have some kind of condition that's met, if that's true, if the condition is met, then we're going to render a certain component to the user. However, if that condition is not met, then we won't render it to the user. So you can start doing things such as, let's say, if the current time of the day is, still afternoon, or if it's like, before 12 p.m., then you want to display some kind of message saying good morning. But if the current time of the day for the user is greater than 12 p.m., so if it's like, 3 p.m., you want to say good afternoon. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and delete all this right over here. And I'm going to delete this as well, because we don't really need it. And I'll declare variable. I'll just call it, let's see, authenticated. So what this variable will basically tell us is if the user is logged in or not. So if the user is logged in, then we'll display a message. We'll just say they're logged in. If they're not logged in, we'll just display a different message. So if we want to conditionally render elements, we can use the curly brace. So remember, this allows us to pretty much write expressions and a bunch of other JavaScript inside here. So I can do something like authenticated. So since this is a Boolean value, I don't need to do something like, authenticated equals true. That's redundant. So we can just do authenticated. And then we can use a ternary operator. And we can say, hey, look, if the user is authenticated, then we will return a div. So I'll just do this. Div you are logged in. Now, if the user's not authenticated, then I will return an h2 please log in. Now, if I go into our app, you can see it says please log in because authenticated is false. If I change this to true, it will say you are logged in. Okay, now we can also use if conditions as well. So inside this function, we can pretty much do something like if authenticated, return an h1 tag, and we'll say please, or not please, you are logged in. Else return please log in. And you can see, there you go, it says you are logged in. Now notice how if I actually get rid of this else, you're going to see that if I actually set this variable to false, you're going to see that we get an error. And the reason why is because there's nothing being returned, because this condition is false, okay, it's not met, but there's nothing to be returned, so it's going to throw this error. So always make sure that you have this else case over here, or something by default to be returned. But yeah, so pretty much you can use this to choose what you want to show to the user. So if the user is logged in, you'll show them, you know, a certain page. If they're not logged in, then you'll redirect them to the home page. That's just an example. So hopefully that part makes sense when it comes to conditional rendering. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about are handling events. So pretty much when it comes to events, if you've done them in HTML before, it's actually very simple in React. So for example, if I wanted to do something after a user clicks on a button, well, we can handle that. If I wanted to do something whenever the user types something in a form, we can also handle it as well. So any event that you can handle with vanilla JavaScript and HTML, you can also do that in React as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply return a div, and I'll just say h1 homepage. We'll just go back to our original code, and we'll delete that as well. And now I want to go ahead and create a simple form that the user can fill out. So let's go ahead and create a component. Let's just call this form.js. Now I'm going to go and import React from React. And in just one line, I'll just simply do export default form. Just like that. Oh, whoops, function form. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So instead of having to do export default on a separate line like this, I'll just simply do export default in form or function form. Okay, and we will just simply return a div. Now inside this div, what I'll do is I'll create my own custom form. So for example, I can use an input field, and I can give it the type of text and placeholder, enter your name, and close it off like this. And now I will go ahead and import that component. So import form from components. We have to go out one directory and step inside components, and we will import form. Now I will import that and then use it over here, and you can see we have our text box. Okay, so when it comes to forms, typically we definitely want to handle a bunch of different events. So let's say, for example, every single time I type something, right? Every single time I click on a button, I want to submit that data to, let's say, some kind of API. So let me actually go ahead and create a button. And we'll just say submit. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll handle a couple of events. So let's say every single time the value of this text box updates, let's do some kind of console log. Or we might want to do something different, but for now we'll just simply do a console log. So what I'll do is I will use the onChange. This is a JSX attribute. So we're going to pass in that function just like that. So this E property, this is the event itself. Okay. And now I can basically do whatever I want. Right? I'll just log the event for now. And if I go ahead and if I open up the console, so notice how if I type, it's going to log this synthetic event. Now if you wanted to get the actual value of whatever's inside this text box, you would reference e.target.value. So if I do, hello, you can see H and then HE and then HEL, HELL and then HELLO. So it's basically triggering the event every single time we change the value of this form or of this input field. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now what if I wanted to get the final value whenever we click on this button? So if I click on submit, it should just give us the entire value. So basically what we want to do is we want to keep track of the value that the user is typing inside this input field. Now to do that, we're going to use a state variable. So with state variables, they can pretty much keep track of values that correspond to the component. In our case, we want to keep track of the input value. So when we click on it, we can actually get the final state, the final value. Now we're going to use a function called React.useState. Now this function is actually going to return an array. So we're going to actually assign it to, so we're going to actually destructure these two values that are returned. Because remember, React.useState is going to return an array, but we can actually do something called array destructuring, and it's going to return two values in that array. The first value is going to be the variable, the state variable. So we can call it whatever we want. I'm going to call it value. The second value that is going to be destructured is going to be a function called set value. So value itself is the state variable, and set value is a function that is going to be responsible for updating the state variable. So that is what React.useState returns. So what we're going to do is let's actually just console log these two to the console. So you can see that it logs undefined and then it logs a function. Okay, so the reason why it's undefined is because we actually don't have a default value set. So we could set a default value. So I can just type default in here and you'll see it'll just log default. So hopefully that makes sense. But it's okay, we'll leave it as undefined, but we can actually just leave it as a empty string instead actually. And what we'll do is every single time this callback function is invoked for onChange, we're going to call set value and we're going to pass an e.target.value. So then what's going to happen is every single time we are typing something new inside the input field, it's going to call set value and it's going to update the value right over here. Now we can actually render this value to the DOM. So for example, if I want to create an h1 and I'll interpolate value. So you can see right over here, if I type in Anson, it'll just auto update on the DOM just like that. Very cool stuff. This is actually known as a process called input binding. So we can bind a certain state variable to our input field. Okay, so now if I were to click on the button, well, I know that once I click on this button, I want the final value of whatever is inside this field. Okay, so it should just give us the value of whatever value is. So I'm going to just use an alert. And let's save, and I'll just type in hello. And if I click submit, you'll see it says hello. Okay, so that's pretty much just an example of how we can update the state variable. Okay, and we can also declare a bunch of other state variables too. So for example, if I want to have another field, we'll first create a password state variable, and then I'll just simply create another input field. But every single time we change the value over here, we will call set password, and I'll just say placeholder, enter your password. Okay, there we go. And if we want, we can also alert both the value and the password. And you can see, hold on. Oh, whoops, I think alert actually only takes in one. So we'll just pass an alert. Okay, so you can see that whatever I type in for password, it's going to be alerted. So that's going to be pretty much it for this whole tutorial. So I just wanted to cover all of the basic things that you could do with React. So I highly encourage you guys to question yourself, ask yourself, what else you could do. Try to play around with some of the things that we just learned. Try to create your own state variables. Try to handle your own events. Try to create your own components. Try to render your own lists, for example. Just do a bunch of different things on your own. I will actually leave a link in the description to a video that I did. It was a simple Pokédex application. It was a very, very beginner application that you can do to pretty much familiarize yourself with what else you can do with React. And I'll also leave some other links in the description that can also enhance your learning with React as well. So hopefully this video all made sense, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace.